for this year's Kronti Akwamu Lecture recognizes the critical importance of the times we live in, both regionally and globally, and what it means for our country, our sub-region, and the African continent at large. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the pleasure to invite you to sit and enjoy this year's Kronti Akwamu Public Lecture. Thank you for your attendance.
Thank you very much, Professor H. Kwesi Prempeh. Let's give him another round of applause. Would like to acknowledge some distinguished guests amongst us this evening, and we have with us Dr. Joseph Whittle. He's a commissioner for SHRAJ. We also have Ambassador Perpetual Dufu. She is a representative from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Also with us this evening is Colonel Retired Larry Bevlolate, Ghana Special Envoy to the Sahelian states. Let's give them a round of applause. Also with us this evening is Professor Ernest Harsh, Columbia University. We have with us Mr. Joseph Asunka, CEO, Afrobarometer. We also have in our midst Ibrahim Tanko with Star Ghana, James Iyao Straha, CDD board member. And also with us we have Jagidi Senomi Nadine, Australian High Commission. We'll acknowledge more of our distinguished guests as we move along. At this juncture, we'll have to introduce the chairperson steering this event this evening. And to do us the honor, let us welcome Ambassador Francis Alex Chiga. He's a senior fellow, Ghana Center for Democratic Development, CDD, Ghana.
When a few days ago, I was asked to introduce the chairperson, I asked them, are you sure you want me to come and do this? You don't want me to take the whole evening. I've known our chairperson for the past over 50 years, and he's one of our most distinguished Ghanaians. So when you want to talk about him, you can spend the whole evening. In fact, some few months ago, a whole evening was spent talking about his achievements in this country, and among the people who spoke for him was a former head of state. At the end of the evening, I realized that they have not even touched most of the things that he has done in his life. They didn't mention the fact that at one time, he was a music promoter. And he was the promoter for Akufo-Addo. What's the name? George Daku. And in the early 80s, when we were in London, he organized a concert promotion for him in London and Berlin. So you can see where I'm coming from. But fortunately, the following day, the office people told me that, Mr. Ambassador, you know how we do these things. We'll prepare something for you. All that you have to do is to come and read. So I have something in front of me, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. Our chairperson is the founding president of the Council on Foreign Relations Ghana, an independent think tank devoted to the studying of international relations. Prior to this role, he served as a resident scholar in diplomatic theory and practice at the Legon Center for International Affairs of the University of Ghana. A seasoned diplomat and public administrator with over 40 years of experience. Ambassador Osei was between 2001 and 2008 the Executive Secretary to the President of the Republic, John Agyekum Kufuor. During this period, he was an integral member of the Cabinet, the Economic Management Team, the Diplomatic Advisory Council. His expertise extended to conflict management, negotiations at both the Economic Community of West Africa States, ECOWAS, and African Union levels. From 1976 to 2000, our chairperson was a Foreign Service officer in Ghana's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. During that period, he served in various diplomatic capacities in Accra, Paris, Conakry, Kinshasa, and Copenhagen. He was also involved in conflict management in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Angola, Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, and Sudan. And I would like to mention that during that period, he was the official interpreter of the President of the Republic, Flight Lieutenant Jerry John Rawlings. Ambassador Osei has been honored with the Order of Gravenhage from Her Royal Highness, the Queen of Netherlands, the Commander of the Order of Moyo by the Republic of Togo, and our own country has honored him with the Ghana Order of Volta, Companion Division, among other distinctions. Ambassador Osei obtained his first degree in French from the University of Ghana, Legon, in 1974. He furthered his studies at the Sheikh Anta Diop Institute in Dakar, Senegal, and holds postgraduate degrees in international relations from the University of Ghana and the Institut International d'Administration Publique, Paris. He also holds an MPhil in International Relations from Sorbonne, Paris. As chairperson of this year's Kronti Akwamu Lecture, Ambassador Osei brings a deep understanding of the evolving global landscape and African place within the leadership, within global landscape and African's place within it. His leadership and distinguished career make him well suited to guide the discussions on the lecture's theme, which is the changing global and multilateral rules-based order, and how countries like Ghana and other African states can navigate these shifts. So, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, please join me in welcoming our chairperson for this evening's session, Ambassador Daniel Akufo-Addo.
Francis, thank you. You know, I myself panicked when I was told that Francis Chega was going to introduce me, because we've been through some rather complex late night situations. And I remember one night I invited him to an OA dinner in London, and I'm sure he doesn't want me to tell the rest of the story. Our very distinguished guest speaker, Her Excellency Hannah Tete, very good friend of mine for many years, and I was particularly pleased when I was asked to chair the occasion, and Kwesi Prempeh didn't need to encourage me at all. And he asked me if I knew her. I said I knew her very well, and that we'd work together. So I'm pleased to be chair for the occasion. Executive Director of CDD, Kwesi, I see that you are determined not to allow me to enjoy my retirement. But one of the reasons why I agreed to chair this lecture was that I think that it is extremely important. And about 3 years ago, I had the privilege of addressing the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences on the same subject. And when I made proposals, subsequently, many of my colleagues warned me that I had been too theoretical. And now that so much has happened since then, I think that we need to engage even further. And maybe Kwesi has set the tone. Basically, what he was saying was that the world is in turmoil, that geopolitical contestations are intensifying, that there are global economic imbalances all over the place, and that the rules and regulations which bind international or multilateralism are being thrown out of the window. So the question simply is that, what is Africa's response to it? I'm really going to leave my dear friend, Her Excellency Hannah Tete, to deal with that. But in responding to this very important question, there are sacrifices that a continent will have to make. And many of the responses that we've had, particularly in reference to Agenda 2063, require, some of them might even require sovereignty cessation in areas of like security and in areas of foreign policy. Are we ready to do that? I'm not too sure. Some of them might require moving the free trade area to a higher level. Are we ready to do that? Are we willing to, for instance, consider a continental currency? In recent times, I'm not sure that the record of Africa internationally indicates that we are willing to be doing that. And let me just take us a sub-region where multilateralism is indeed backsliding. And in wanting to respond to these global trends, some of our responses seem to fall short. The most recent summit, ECOWAS summit, in its review from its initial document, talked about a review of the world order and acknowledged that indeed the world is in turmoil. But in trying to respond to the post-coup d'etats, etc., we decided to choose a new ECOWAS chairman who has internal limitations, whose parliament has over 90% majority in parliament. How is Senegal going to lead a reform of integration or regionalism, particularly when Senegal has publicly endorsed an African candidature for the US Secretary Generalship? And that lead has been publicly disavowed by at least 16 members of the PR at the AU. And when I read the communique, I asked myself, are we willing to face these geopolitical challenges in the world? And what I found most strange is that the chairman, campaign manager for Macky Sall is Mbolo, former president of Guinea-Bissau. And what is worse, we immediately then threw in the former Ugandan foreign minister, brilliant diplomat. I'm not arguing about that. I worked with him, so I know him well. Oxford-trained lawyer, brilliant. But Africa, we understand the rotation. Kofi Annan was allowed 2 terms. So why are we throwing in 2 candidates, and when we know that we are not going to get the position of UN Secretary General? It is these attitudes that we are demonstrating which make me worry about what our genuine responses even about the new economic paradigm, which can provide real answers to what Africa should be doing on this matter. But there's a little hope. And I think that part of that hope is about leadership. And there was a time when in Africa, we had a batch of African leaders who had the courage to dare the rest of their colleagues. And it was mostly led by Meles Zenawi, Mbeki, Wad, etc. And they would, during our summits, go into conclave and decide that what the continent was doing was wrong and come and challenge their colleagues when we were talking about APRM and NEPAD. And fortunately, Ghana is about to take over the chairmanship of the African Union next year. My goodness, what an opportunity. And maybe this discussion will provide the basis of the kind of vision in determining our policy options, and we should not waste this opportunity. So Hannah has a huge task on her shoulders, and I'm sure that the questions and answers will be very, very helpful. And I'm glad that my friend Colonel, the Special Envoy to Sahel, is here. And I'm really looking forward to an evening of serious discussions from all of you. And thank you very much for making me chairman.
Another round of applause for Ambassador DK. When I first saw Ambassador DK Osei, the other name that came to mind was Ambassador, not Ambassador, but DK Poison. I'm quite young, but I heard the stories about him being a boxing heavyweight. At least out of his 48 fights, he won 40. And that's quite a remarkable achievement. Let's give him another round of applause. I'd like to acknowledge some more distinguished guests amongst us. We have Professor Audrey Gajakpo. She's board chair of CDD Ghana. Let's do it better. Let's do it better. If she's here, she can wait for us to see. We also have in our midst Rear Admiral Godwin Livinus Bessing. He's Chief of Naval Staff. We have Professor Emmanuel Jimabwedi, co-founder of CDD Ghana. Also, Emerita Professor Techua Menwa, Senior Fellow, CDD Ghana. We have Tiffany Yantz. We can do it better. Let's go ahead and give it better. At this point in the event, we will invite Bloco to give us some exciting cultural performance. Let's give them a round of applause. I'm told they are not ready yet. We go ahead in the program, and at this point in time, we will invite Mrs. Sadia Chinri Hesse. She's board member, Ghana Center for Democratic Development, to introduce our speaker for the event. Please, let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you, and good evening. Please allow me to stand on existing protocols as I perform the very pleasant duty to introduce my colleague at the bar, my senior, I should say, and a fellow member of the International Federation of Women Lawyers. Her Excellency Hannah Sewa Tete is the United Nations Special General Representative for Libya and head of the United Nations Support Mission in Libya. A distinguished Ghanaian lawyer, diplomat, and stateswoman, She has over 3 decades of experience in governance, diplomacy, international relations, conflict resolution, and democratic development. Before assuming her current role, Her Excellency Tete served as the United Nations Secretary General's Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa, where she led high-level diplomatic efforts to promote peace, security, and regional cooperation. Earlier, she served as the Director General of the United Nations Office at Nairobi, one of the UN's 3 global headquarters, before being appointed as the UN's Secretary General's Special Representative to the Africa Union and head of the UN Office to the Africa Union. In Ghana, Her Excellency Tete served as Minister for Foreign Affairs and Regional Integration from 2013 to 2017, where she played a pivotal role in advancing Ghana's foreign policy priorities, strengthening regional integration within ECOWAS, and promoting international cooperation. Earlier, she served as Minister for Trade and Industry, leading reforms to enhance Ghana's trade competitiveness and private sector development. Prior to her ministerial appointments, she built a successful legal career in private practice and corporate law. A former Member of Parliament for the Ewutu Senya West constituency, Her Excellency Tete has also held leadership positions within the National Democratic Congress, including serving as the party's General Secretary. Throughout her public service career, she has championed democratic governance, gender equality, regional integration, and multilateral cooperation. Recognized internationally for her diplomatic leadership and commitment to peace building, Her Excellency Tete has represented Ghana and the United Nations in numerous high-level negotiations and multilateral engagements. Her current work has focused on mediation, conflict prevention, governance, and strengthening partnerships to address complex political and security challenges across Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, may I ask you please to join me in welcoming our main speaker for today, Her Excellency Hawa Sarah Tete. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First, to Ambassador Dike Osei. As he said, he's a very good friend of mine, and I'm deeply appreciative of the fact that he was able to attend this evening and do me the honor of chairing this event. So, Mr. Chairman, the chairman of the Center for Democratic Development, Dr. Audrey Gajipo, members of government, thank you very much, Larry, for being here today. Members of the Diplomatic Corps, Excellencies, members of the Diplomatic Corps, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, first, let me express my appreciation to the Ghana Center for Democratic Development for their invitation to speak at this year's annual Kronti Akwamu Lecture. It's an honor to join their distinguished speakers in discussing topical issues. And I've chosen this topic because I believe that several recent developments in the multilateral system and what has been referenced as the rules-based order it established are undermining its foundations with profound implications for our continent and our country. If the multilateral system continues to fracture and deteriorate, it will be to the detriment of countries with less power and influence on the stage, and therefore collective interest to sustain the effective parts of the system, to support the aspirations for peace, security, and prosperity shared by all United Nations member states. The multilateral system as we know it was established by the UN Charter in 1945 and has since expanded beyond the Security Council, General Assembly, headquarters, departments of the organization to include other UN institutions, agencies, funds, and programs. And as more multilateral organizations have been created at the regional/continental level, such as our African Union, sub-regional level, such as ECOWAS, The UN and these other organizations have diversified and broadened their areas of focus. But at the same time, they've sought to work with each other and convene member states to address collective action problems. The multilateral system as we know it is underpinned by the understanding that crises that are affecting a country or a group of countries can have impacts not only on specific national contexts, but also on the broader global community. And so it's been seen as necessary for states to collaborate through the UN and other platforms to address such challenges. And in the words of our former late Secretary General Kofi Annan, the challenges of our age are problems without passports, and to address them we need blueprints without borders. The collective action problems the multilateral system was established to address have changed over the 8 decades of the organization's existence, but still remain collective problems. In a January 2021 address to member states, the current United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, described the world as facing a 5-alarm global crisis. The first alarm was, at the time, the COVID-19 pandemic. The second was the failure of the global financial system, which he characterized as morally bankrupt, favoring the wealthy and penalizing the poor. The third was the climate crisis, which he stated necessitated an emergency response to combat it. The fourth was the growing digital chaos, benefiting the most destructive forces and denying opportunities to ordinary people. And in this regard, he highlighted the need to expand internet access because a third of the world is not yet connected, while addressing data misuse, misinformation, and cybercrime. And he warned that personal information is being exploited to control or manipulate individuals to change their behavior, violate human rights, and undermine democratic institutions. He therefore called for a strong regulatory framework to alter the business models of social media companies that profit from algorithms prioritizing addiction, outrage, and anxiety at the expense of public safety. And his fifth and final point, which I think is even more pertinent at the moment, was on peace and security, noting that the world faced the highest number of violent conflicts since 1945. And he emphasized the need to manage geopolitical divides to prevent global chaos and called on member states to maximize areas for cooperation while establishing robust mechanisms to avoid escalation. Although the COVID-19 pandemic is thankfully behind us, the threat of future epidemics and pandemics are alive and well. But the other collective action problems he was referencing remain as significant today as they were in 2021. Member states' responses to the 5-alarm global crisis he referenced was the development of the Pact for the Future, which was adopted by the General Assembly in September 2024 to address these and other associated challenges. However, when powerful nations exercise statecraft in a manner perceived as coercive and exploitative by smaller nations and disregard international humanitarian and human rights law, it undermines the UN's capacity to engage and address these issues. When common rules and frameworks developed over the last 80 years are under threat, and the principle of sovereign equality among UN member states is challenged as great power politics returns, it places pressure on countries that do not have the means to individually hold their own and are unable to act unilaterally. And that is the context as we know it for many African countries. As member states question the policies and strategies that drove globalization and a more integrated world economy in a way that does not merely lead to a temporary shift, and as more countries view the current system's shortcomings as deficient in adequately protecting their interests, it indicates a profound shift from the thinking of the last 4 decades. Previously, globalization was seen as inevitable, and its impacts, both positive and negative, were once considered the new normal. But now, we're moving from a world that views globalization and a more integrated world as inevitable to a situation where even stronger nations see this as risky and harmful to their national interests. Or I should qualify that, some stronger nations. During the period when globalization was seen to be ascendant, the assumption was that accepting systems of governance that lean towards liberal democracy and integration into the global economy would lead to greater prosperity. states prioritize governance reforms and investments to infrastructure to attract foreign direct investment, which it was expected would support economic growth and diversification, introduce new technologies and production capacities, and encourage the growth of new sectors, including services. Globalization and the promotion of free trade under the multilateral system enabled countries to focus on economic growth without incurring significant security costs for protection and self-preservation. However, when powerful states are prepared to use their dominance to extract concessions, utilize subsidies and export surpluses to diminish the competitiveness of other countries' industries, and where bilateral debt and infrastructure investments can increase a state's dependency on sovereign creditors, this creates an entirely different dynamic. Where the threat of unilateral military action either directly against a state or in a neighboring state becomes normalized, then we're living in a world where weaker states are exposed to greater vulnerabilities on multiple fronts. When power is reflected in the ability to build, finance, and command systems of technology, industry, logistics, and force, the room for maneuver that a state has depends to a large extent on the strength of its economy, its productive capacities, its capacity and resources to defend its interests, and the extent to which it has been able to build a level of resilience to internal and external shocks. Where multilateralism is weakening, bilateral agreements and partnerships become the more predominant form of member states' foreign policy engagement. And in this context, the weakening of the multilateral system creates a situation where security and national development are increasingly interconnected and brings greater focus on the interplay between geopolitics and geoeconomics. Earlier this year, I'm sure some of you might remember, the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, in an address in Davos, referred to this change as a rupture in the world order and the end of a nice story, heralding a brutal reality where geopolitics among the great powers is not subject to any constraints. He also argued that other countries, particularly middle powers, have the capacity to build an order that embodies the values of the rules-based order, such as respect for human rights, sustainable development, solidarity, sovereignty, and the territorial integrity of states. He noted that every day we are reminded that we live in an era of great power rivalry and that the rules-based order is fading. He observed that in this development, we would have a situation where the strong can do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must. And that faced with this logic, there is a strong tendency for countries to go along to get along, to accommodate and to avoid trouble, and to hope that compliance will buy safety. So in this context, what does that mean for Africa? It presents a somewhat bleak scenario for the smaller economies of our continent. But we are living in a time when that could become our reality. And in a world that is increasingly multipolar, and the focus is on multipolar engagements as opposed to broadly multilateral. And so the way in which countries of our continent will focus their alliances and shape their interventions will certainly determine what place Africa will have and what role we will play in a global future. In an era of great power competition with states reviewing their national security strategies and foreign policy priorities, and where relations between states are becoming much more sharply focused on interests, despite criticisms of the United Nations' effectiveness, its institutions have been the forum for all member states to engage and resolve their differences and find solutions for the problems without passports. Africa has been influential when it has taken collective positions and committed to work together to advance them. This was evident ahead of the development of the current United Nations Sustainable Development Goals agenda, where Africa developed a common African position. And this led to a situation where 80% of Africa's Agenda 2063 priorities were reflected in the SDGs. And so it shows that when we do make the effort, we can have an impact. We all aspire on this continent to growth and prosperity, But we must recognize that there is increasing competition between African states in their effort to expand global influence, to attract foreign direct investment, and to have a stronger, more integrated economy will help to build our resilience. Therefore, our competition should not be mutually destructive. It should focus on being mutually cooperative. If we look at the most recent economic data, I'm referencing the IMF data from the World Economic Outlook of April 2026. The US accounts for 14.54% of global GDP, the EU 13.77%, and China 19.89%. This represents almost half of global GDP. And the African region, referring both in this case to North and Sub-Saharan Africa, contributes 5.62%. And so within that context, for us, working together is not a luxury, it's an imperative. But as Ambassador Say himself mentioned, it will mean making some compromises. And it will also mean that those countries that are recognized as Africa's middle powers, South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, also have to come along with the rest of the continent. But that's going to be a more challenging situation, especially where we have situations where there are a number of countries, such as Algeria, Morocco, Ethiopia, and Kenya, that have very much their own foreign policy priorities that they are able to advance using their distinct diplomacy efforts to drive policy to their own advantage. And so we have to think differently. Currently, we have 20 African countries classified as low income, 24 as lower middle income, 8 as upper middle income, and only 1 as high income by the World Bank. And the high income country is Seychelles, an island nation of about 100,000 people. And so our dependence on multilateralism to level an uneven playing field is important and is something that we cannot afford to negate. But in this era of increasing protectionism, the weaponization of trade, opting out of agreed frameworks to address global risks, such as climate change, and replacing universal and multilateral agreements with bilateral agreements, while these are sometimes expedient, they can risk the gains that Africa has achieved through negotiating on the back of common African positions. And that is the reason why I am making the argument that, notwithstanding the developments, this still has to be the priority and the focus of our efforts. Because the shocks that the world is currently facing are going to impact us in ways that would be more harmful to us than other parts of the world that have greater resilience. The Economic Commission for Africa, the African Union, and the African Development Bank, in a joint paper published last year, assessed the impact of the withdrawal of preferential market access from the US for the continent. And they noted that due to the reciprocal tariffs that override or complicate the AGWA framework, exports to the US could fall by 8 to 21%, depending on the specific tariff scenario. Additionally, secondary economic shocks and knock-on effects could slow production and reduce demand from major trading partners, threatening African commodity and oil exports. Now, there was a short-term extension agreed in February of this year, which ends at the end of this year. And so what happens after that is anybody's guess. But statements from the Office of the US Trade Representative indicate that future extensions will demand greater reciprocal market access for US businesses and farmers. The ECA projects in its report that the impact of the withdrawal of preferential market access will increasingly favor bilateral deals over non-reciprocal continental-wide agreements. Contrast this with the recent announcement from the Customs Tariff Commission of the State Council and Ministry of Commerce of China, announcing the expansion of zero tariff preferences to all 20 non-LDC African nations, in addition to an earlier announcement on 1st December 2024 of unilateral duty-free access across 100% of all tariff lines to 33 African least developed countries. It envisaged that during a 2-year transition period, China would negotiate bilateral framework agreements on economic partnerships for shared development with participating non-LDC partner states. one could say that competition for access to Africa's resources is heating up. And this is going to be the next arena in which our ministries of foreign affairs, trade and industry, and finance are going to have to pay attention to how well they negotiate. Now, the rules-based order, as I said, and as acknowledged in Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech, has its weaknesses. The stronger countries have sometimes exempted themselves when they've perceived that their strategic interests have been at stake. However, the system had its benefits for weaker countries, and we have to reflect on effective responses, both collectively and individually, to maintain the multilateral, minimize the impact of the return to great power competition for the continent's natural resources, including food, energy security, and critical minerals, powering the age of AI. But we must also look at our own internal weaknesses. Otherwise, we will not be addressing these issues in the appropriate manner. We have to consider the world as it is, as opposed to how we wish it to be. And based on this perspective, we've got to examine the key actions necessary to strengthen the continent's position. And to do that, I want us to reflect a bit about the African Union and how it has operated. Within the context of the African Union, the commitment to implement the position remains uneven, and that is being polite. There are expressions of unity on much weaker when regime security in a member state is threatened, where geopolitical alignment or material interests have been involved. And I would like to refer you to a speech at the 37th Ordinary Summit of the African Union in February 2024 by the then chairperson of the African Union, Musa Faki Mahamat, noting that the tendency to make decisions without real political will to implement them had become detrimental to the organization's credibility. He cited the example of 93% of decisions not being implemented over the previous 3 years, 2021, 2022, and 2023, noting that this defiance of decisions at the level of member states and regional economic communities was evident and had led to overstepping and even violating the decisions of continental bodies. Now, coming from the then chairperson, expressing frustration about what had not happened in the first 3 years of his second 4-year term, I think is quite instructive. And to the best of my knowledge, progress on implementation has not advanced in any particularly spectacular ways. And it's not the challenge with the Commission, it's the challenge with member states. We don't implement the things that we have agreed to do. And if we don't implement the things that we have agreed to do, how do we expect anything different to happen? But at the last African Union Summit in February 2026, the President of Kenya, Dr. William Ruto, who is the current champion of African Union institutional reform, made recommendations that led to the Assembly adopting Decision 967 to draft a common African foreign policy framework by the next summit in 2027. So, how does this become more than a statement of solidarity or intent and a program that the countries of the continent can work with? I think that the decision indicates recognition by member states of some of the issues that I'm raising in this paper. But I think that it would be overly ambitious to expect that we could have agreed among 55 or 54 member states, depending on how you are counting. And I say 55 or 54 because the AU counts 55, the UN counts 54. Which also, in and of itself, says quite a bit, right? And to have that level of detail that we expect within policy positions. And so my suggestions in this paper are to focus on a couple of core objectives where perhaps we can agree to work together to advance the continent's position on these issues, and not develop a foreign policy priority or a set of foreign policy priorities that aspire to be all things to all people that we know, like 93% of the decisions between 2021, 2022, and 2023, as at 2024, were not implemented. We also should recognize that the foundations of the African Union are the regional economic communities. Even though they're not subsidiary organizations, the decisions that are taken at the level of the RECs that reinforce the decisions of the African Union and that support their implementation are the things that help to make the AU more effective. And if we can come to consensus at the level of the RECs on specific issues and then build that into continental positions, we are more likely to respect those outcomes than what happens within this discussion of 54, 55 member states. We don't always necessarily agree to do the right things. And we can have a consensus and the decisions will be adopted knowing that there isn't really any serious intention to implement them anyway. And so I want to focus on a couple of areas where I think that this could be, or these could be, those areas of focus for the African Union going forward. And the first one, I would say, should be strengthening the implementation of the AFCFTA. Now, we've talked about it. Thankfully, we have it ratified. Thankfully, many of the key protocols that are necessary for the implementation have been finalized, but agreements don't implement themselves. And there's a difference between market access and market readiness. And it is important to focus first, not only on having these protocols agreed, ratified, but domesticated, and then within our institutions, implemented, and our private sector organizations supported to be able to take advantage of them so that we will be able to derive the positive impacts from the AFCFTA. And I would suggest that we benchmark progress on implementation with the World Bank's Logistics Performance Index. Now, I know many of you have heard about the Doing Business indicators, which at a point in time was what we all measured our performance by. And I know you've heard the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Index. But the Logistics Performance Index is more granular. It looks at the issues relating to trade facilitation. How quickly can you actually clear goods through a particular country? How efficient are the institutions in supporting trade? And how well are they able to function? And now, thanks to AI, they've been able to, on a regular basis, update this, not annually, but almost on a monthly basis. So there's a way of tracking performance throughout the year. And I think that if we can find a way of matching that, it would be useful. 2, focusing on advocacy for the reform of the global financial system, what the UN Secretary General referred to in his 5 alarm fires that were affecting the global economy, because there's the need, 1, to do that, but at the same time to enhance domestic capital mobilization within the continent on a large scale. Because expecting that this is going to be achieved on the back of foreign direct investment or aid, I think is a thing of the past. As at the 15th of June 2026, the OECD report on preliminary official development assistance levels in 2025 notes that total ODA fell from member countries and associates of the Development Assistance Committee by 23.1% in real terms, with 26 of 34 members reducing their ODA. This is of the OECD. The 5 largest providers combined, France, Germany, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States, accounted for 95.7% of the total fall. That should tell you the direction of travel. And so expecting that we are going to be able to have access to the same level of support and resources, I think, is a luxury that we cannot afford. And so certainly it's something the continent should focus on. Then climate advocacy. But climate advocacy that is combined with the imperative for economic development and infrastructure expansion. And that means access to energy as well. Making sure that the transition that Africa undertakes in its effort at building resilience and mitigating the impact of climate change not prevent us from utilizing the resources that are most easily available to us to make sure that our economies can develop. Then we should have a common African position on AI governance, because this is talking about the future. In the words of the current UNSG, technology that will shape the future of humanity must be shaped by all of humanity. Because the impact that AI could have on conflict development and many aspects of individual social life is such that ensuring inclusive AI governance should be our priority. And finally, silencing the guns. For our continent to achieve its development aspirations, we said that we need a continent at peace with itself and within its borders. At the present time, it's clear that this aspiration is going to take significant effort to achieve. We said we're going to do that in 2020. The target has been postponed to 2030. But recognize that we are 3 years away from 2030. And the number of conflicts on the continent has increased and not decreased. And so if we are going to be able to achieve that target, then we need an acceleration of our diplomatic and mediation efforts to get there. Otherwise, some of these conflicts that we have are going to be even further entrenched. And it's not something that we should just think about in abstract because our country is not subject to those challenges. We share a border with the AES states. And even if it is one border, it is our point of fragility, as Larry himself knows very well. And I'm sure many of us in this room have been paying attention to over the period. And so, if that is where we are, and that is our risk, then we have to figure out within West Africa how we manage that risk. But at the same time, we must understand that this is not just a West African problem. The African Union Peace and Security Council in December last year, in the Continental Early Warning and Security Outlook, noted that Africa is at a strategic crossroads and faces a terrorism landscape of unprecedented depth, complexity, and lethality. It also highlighted acute structural vulnerabilities within a number of member states, and that security conditions in some contexts were deteriorating rather than improving. The threat of terrorism within the Sahel region was mentioned. Unconstitutional changes of government was also identified as another challenge, and entrenched civil wars. And you know something, from where I am right now in Libya, one of the things that strikes me is that the rate of regional integration among criminal networks and terrorist groups is expanding faster than it is among member states. And that should be a cause for concern, because it means our institutions are having to play catch up, and we're not doing it very well. So what I've just described for you should tell you that this is something that should engage all of our attention, because it's a new normal we don't want to live with. And so we very much look forward to the efforts of Special Envoy Bevlolati protecting us from the implications, at least within the confines of our country, Ghana. And so unless we have a concerted effort to support the states under terrorist threat, to re-establish state authority, address the root causes of their crisis, the threat will not only persist, it will continue to spread. And let us remember that the technologies that we have become used to using, right? AI, apps, cryptocurrencies, and for terrorists and criminal networks, the dark web, are just as available to them as they are to us. And given a situation where they are working together much more closely, they have the ability to be several steps ahead of state institutions in the way in which they deploy their capacities. And we saw that recently in Mali. With because to have that many simultaneous attacks happening in different cities at the same time is something that shows a level of planning and coordination that was previously unknown to these groups. If that is our new normal, then we've got to think about how we deal with this in a very proactive manner. In addition, we've got to focus on post-conflict recovery. A lot of the work that I've done over the last couple of years has not just focused on negotiating peace agreements, but making sure that those peace agreements are implemented. Because when we don't focus on post-conflict recovery, and we expect that these very fragile states are going to somehow manage to pull themselves out of the quagmire, settle, and be able to resume their path towards development, then we are expecting miracles of countries where institutions have collapsed, where capacities no longer exist, and where they will be unable to do that without sufficient support. And so, in that context, I think it's important for us to recognize that solidarity, not just speaking solidarity, but really acting solidarity, focus and implementing policies and programs with the emphasis on implementation, and not just saying that we have announced these things, is going to be what we need to be doing much more of going forward. And prioritizing inclusive governance in our multi-ethnic, multicultural contexts has to be the priority of every African Union member state. Because without that, given the artificiality of our borders, how do we expect to stay united and peaceful? So what does this mean for Ghana? I listened to the mid-year review of the budget by the Finance Minister, Honorable Dr. Akufo-Addo, last week. And I was greatly encouraged, I must say, by his optimistic assessment of the future economic prospects of our country, due to the efforts that have been made over the last year and a half. But nonetheless, as I listened to him, I was thinking to myself, this positive trajectory requires efforts at insulating the economy as much as is possible from external shocks. And the way in which we advance our foreign policy interests will either complement or have a minimal impact on building our needed resilience. And I think that one of the things that happens in Ghana is that we take so much for granted. And we believe that we have been peaceful, we are peaceful, we will always be peaceful. The examples of our neighbors should tell us that that is not the case. We cannot take our peace and security for granted. And we should not assume that because we haven't been hit by those kind of conflicts yet, it will not happen. The most painful thing when you have seen countries in conflict is the amount of destruction that has taken place to infrastructure that you know has been built on the back of extensive borrowing. And so you have a situation where the infrastructure that has been constructed and not yet paid for is already destroyed, and you're wondering, how are they going to get new money to be able to do that all over again? And how long is it going to take for them to get there and to be able to achieve the level of development that they previously had, and then be able to build on that to move forward? So the fact that we haven't had it is a blessing, but I want to emphasize that peace building, even within a national context, should be seen as an investment that we must be making on a continuous basis. It's like a garden. You need to tend to it in order to make sure that the weeds don't overrun it and create conditions that we may not be ready to live with. Because we must also recognize that while it's very exciting to have significant foreign policy achievements that are big announcements about initiatives and, programs that we are working with, and I'm sure Ambassador Osei and all of the colleagues from the Foreign Ministry know this, the grunt work of making sure that the things that we agree on actually transform into workable programs, projects, and initiatives at the national level require as much time and attention as the big ticket items. Otherwise, we are never going to be able to achieve those benefits. And that brings me to the way in which we work within government. We need a whole of government approach to foreign policy. It should not just be an issue for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Regional Integration. The ministry is not an island that stands on itself, excluded from the rest of the government machinery. Because when you have a situation where you've got our diplomats, and sometimes very dedicated, conscientious foreign service officers, who are working in their country context to promote Ghana as an investment destination, to make sure that different ministries, departments, and agencies are notified and prepared for big meetings and discussions that are coming up, who follow through when you are not there to follow through. If there is not an effective coordination mechanism with the rest of government, how do we expect to achieve the benefits of that effort. And if we take the reports that come from the embassies as regular reports that are just stacked and put aside and nobody really reads them and focuses on what they say, what do you expect to get out of it? The most depressing thing, I think, for our foreign service officers is when they put all of that effort into trying to alert people at home to what is going on, and it becomes another email or it becomes another report on a desk that never even transfers from one ministry to another. Let's talk about another institution that has the responsibility of implementation. And then the question is, with that investment that we are making in diplomatic presences, are we reaping the returns of our investment? And I would like to suggest that this is something that we certainly have to take more seriously and have inter-institutional, which means ministries, departments, and agencies, effective coordination platforms to plan, not just to go and attend and participate, but to come back and review and make sure that we focus on implementing. These are basics. And they're really not things that I should be standing here on a platform to talk about. But the fact that I find it necessary to draw attention to this is because I know that it is not happening enough. And it is something that has to be what we consider going forward. And, for all of the colleagues, former colleagues at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you do not have to associate with my statement. I can carry the weight of it myself. But I'm sure you agree with me. We also have to note that the African Continental Free Trade Area, whose secretariat is here in Ghana, means that we actually have access to this institution in a way that no other member state has. And it is a travesty. It would be a travesty if we do not make sure that as Ghana, we have not achieved market readiness on the back of the AFCFTA. Because market access is different from market readiness. Market readiness means you are in a position to provide support to your businesses, to your SMEs, to enable them to go out and compete on the back of the access that they have been given. But it means you need to have your embassies with commercial officers who are front-facing these target African markets that we want to go to, who have the experience and the understanding of the economies in which they work, and who can talk about the opportunities and provide that information to our private sector business associations and to our small and medium enterprises, so that they can identify the opportunities for themselves. Their costs are already high. The regulatory burden is significant. And so if you want them to be able to benefit from it, we have to make an extra effort to provide them with that support. We need, as a continent, to have greater access to international capital markets. But in what I've just described as a fracturing world order, we should not take that access for granted. We should also not just be satisfied that our economic outlook has improved. We actually have to engage with international financial institutions to help them to understand our context better, because that will give them a greater understanding of the risk profile. Currently, African debt, as every economist, and I'm not one, knows, is overpriced in terms of the interest costs. So how do we bring that down? Because risk is a matter also of perception. But with all of the conflict that we have on the continent, and because still there are not that many countries and individuals, and especially in the capital markets, who are able to differentiate between the different country contexts, they see us as one. So our risk is not really differentiated in a way that would make an impact for us. And as a result of which, we are competing, and in spite of all of the efforts that we are making, we're not seeing that that is translating in helping us to get better terms to be able to support our key infrastructure investments. Everything that we aspire for will be done on the back of data, knowledge, trust, and leverage of our assets, both in terms of our institutional capacity and in terms of the people we have, and how we engage within the different multilateral frameworks. At the sub-regional level, at the regional level, and also within the context of the UN. And so what we need to be doing is planning to make sure that we expand our access and our leverage as much as practically possible. And as I said, working together with a whole of government approach in order to make sure that we do this in a way that is coherent. Now we have the ministerial advisory boards, and I've worked with a number of ministerial advisory boards, but yes, it's a great structure to help us to understand what are the key priorities at the level, if you like, at the strategic level. But it doesn't necessarily translate into the level of implementation. And so taking the decisions of those bodies and then making sure that at the working level they are implemented also has to be part of our new normal. We have to take an active interest in supporting our neighbors to address their security challenges, especially in the Sahel states, working with the AES, ECOWAS, the AU, UN, and other international organizations to help fight the growing terrorist threat. And across the continent, and this is not just an issue for Ghana, we must recognize that migration is becoming a much, much more contested issue in which we have to be much more strategic in our engagement. Because till date, we haven't really been able to do that in a way that focuses on protecting our diasporas, discouraging illegal migrants, and at the same time, amongst ourselves as African countries, also focusing on what it is that we are going to be able to do to make sure that among ourselves, we address this very sensitive issue in a proactive manner. And I'm saying that because we've all seen recently the whole narrative about South Africa and the challenges that African migrants have had in South Africa. I have to tell you that it's not just an issue for South Africa. Where I am in Libya, it is a point where the majority of African migrants trying to go to Europe try to exit through Libyan corridors because the state institutions are weak. But I can assure you that that journey is probably more perilous than the current situation in South Africa. And the number of people who die on their way there, right? And the work that I think, well, not that I think, I know that our embassy has to do in Libya, especially when they find out that there are Ghanaians who have perished along the way, and they actually retrieve their bodies and give them Muslim funerals. That data has not been in the public domain as much, and so we're not cognizant of the scale at which it is happening. But I think that we should pay more attention to it, because for all of those who believe that the path to Europe is the way in which they are going to achieve their futures, we should be very, very sensitive to the fact that Europe and the Western world is closing its doors to illegal migration. And so what does that mean? With regard to the Western world, I think both at the continental, sub-regional level and as a country, we would have to expand our efforts to negotiate for legal labor channels and the protection of the rights of diaspora citizens, whose remittances are an important source of foreign exchange inflows. Among African member states themselves, I anticipate that this will be a contentious issue that will require very sensitive conversations to take place, because juxtaposing the desire of some member states to get rid of what they consider to be illegal migrants, returning them to their host countries, while at the same time advocating for the ease of travel restrictions and making it easier to travel across our continent in order to be able to do business, is going to be a very sensitive balancing act. And given the fact that we have quite a large diaspora, both abroad in the Western world, but also within the continent, I would say that going forward, that is going to be a particularly significant issue for Ghana that we should be paying attention to. Because we also do not necessarily welcome all the migrants who come into our space. And we also are not necessarily entirely pleased with having people congregating around our traffic lights, coming from different parts of the region who we consider to be foreigners. And even though we're not expelling them, the truth of the matter is that we're not really welcoming to them either. And so if we think that this is not going to be something that we have to focus on both in the short and medium term, then I think we're deluding ourselves. So going forward, especially at the national level, I would suggest that this is something we have to focus on in much more detail. So, in short, we've got to invest in building institutions that are in a state of readiness, not just to promote our economic development, but to respond rapidly to threats and crises. That means not only focusing primarily on economic growth and prosperity, as important as that is, but also on human security, social cohesion in order to build a resilient state. Over the years, we've done an incredible amount of work on policies, programs, and initiatives. Now the emphasis must be on effective implementation and execution, monitoring and evaluation, and ensuring that the resources we have available are put to efficient use to achieve these outcomes. We need to build a resilient state to meet the challenge of a multipolar, competitive, and interest-based world order, and engage in active diplomacy within our continent and beyond, especially with our sub-regional neighbors, to survive the storms ahead. Earlier in my remarks, I referred to the speech of Prime Minister Mark Carney in Davos. And I'd like to end by quoting from an article co-authored by the Prime Minister and President Alexander Stubb of Finland in The Economist of the 8th of July this year. Both leaders have been reflecting on this issue over the last year in various public speeches and in fora and publications. And in this particular article, they state, and I quote, "Power no longer exclusively sits at a single Western center. Power is spread across three groupings: a global West, a global East, and a global South, each increasingly autonomous. Truly global trends, including power over computers, data, and artificial intelligence models, are spawning a fourth technology-driven grouping, shaping how we live, work, and connect, unconstrained by borders and accountable to very few rules. The world order built after 1945 is unraveling. Institutions as they stand are ill-prepared to avert this decline. This is a moment that comes once in a century, in which our collective prosperity is defined by what we choose to build and how we build it. The work ahead requires neither wishful multilateralism, which only defends the status quo, nor cold realpolitik that dismantles it altogether. The alternative is values-based realism, a new approach that is both principled and pragmatic. Principled in its commitment to the fundamental values of freedom, human rights, sustainability, and solidarity. Pragmatic in recognizing that not every partner will share all of our values. But these are values that we have espoused on the African continent in almost all our foundational documents, so they are not alien to us. And if we believe that they are not alien to us, and if we recognize the fact that the world is at a critical turning point, then it means that we really have to think about what we do differently. If this is the world we are moving into, where Ghana and Africa will stand in this multipolar dynamic will depend on the choices we make, the decisions we implement, and the effort we place in building an African multilateralism that reflects this reality and prepares us to face its challenges. I hope that as a country, we can reflect on the current developments and position ourselves to be able to better adapt to this situation and advance our interests towards a peaceful, stable, and prosperous country, notwithstanding the emerging headwinds and the uncertainty that comes in its wake. And let's hope that indeed we can do that. Thank you very much.
Her Excellency Hannah Sewatete there. Very great speech, deserving of that applause. You may have your seats. So much to chew on. I picked up a few pointers that she said. And indeed, it's interesting. And she says our competition should not be mutually constructive and not destructive. Working together is an imperative, and it is. And to summarize all she said is, so also be fair. Now what's I mean, it's an opportune time for Africa to come together as one, and I know you agree with me. Please, once again, let's give her a round of applause. We'll have time to take questions from our audience. But before then, let's acknowledge some dignitaries amongst us. We have in our midst Rooney Skinnybag, Ambassador, the European Union. Also in our midst, Spio Gabra, Ghana Special Envoy on Reparations. Tiffany Yan, Second Secretary, Australian High Commission. We have Mrs. Gizala Tete Agbotui, Member of Parliament, Ewutu Senior West, and also Deputy Housing Minister. Wilson Carol U.S. Embassy, Acting Political Councillor. Jacinta Kwao, GIZ Technical Advisor. Nana Santua Fajinu, Executive Director, WASI. Brigitte Jogbenuku, former flag bearer of the PPP. Also, Bernard Orteville, Bank of Ghana Director. We have Duke Mensa Opoku, British High Commission, Senior Political Officer. Her Excellency Josephine Nkrumah, Representative of the President of ECOWAS in Liberia. Frida Bedietu Puni, Ghana Permanent Mission to the United Nations, Head of Chancery. Amos Ansa, KPMG, Associate Director, beg your pardon. We also have Elizabeth Villas, Co-Chair, Codeo. We can give them a round of applause, please. We also have Clara Kasati, Vice Chair, CDD Ghana Board. And at this juncture, we'll invite Bloko to give us a dance performance.
my name is Pamela from Customer Service. Please revalidate your account by texting your Ghana card number to 0500,000 247.
Hey, Abili, wabedim.
Madam, give me the numbers behind your ATM card. I'm calling from the head office.
An email was delivered across to our customers this morning.
Confirm if this is your bank account. 100,100,100.
Thanks for sending your bank card details.
Send the OTP now to avoid cancellation.
EcoBank will never call, email, send an SMS asking for your PIN, OTP, bank card, or Ghana card details.
Don't get played. EcoBank, the Pan-African Bank.
Hello, please, I'm calling from Customer Experience Center.
My name is Mohammed Adam Ramadan. I represent the good people of Adenta constituency here in Parliament, and I want to pledge that my democracy is not for sale.
Eye bibi kitua bi na den sakraya ba etoda a ehya free baby out. Ohwepa enye dede na emom edin bre a obiara ani nwo.
Suban pasha asiefi meso ne woso wofie.
Good conduct, great life is brought to you by
Indomie.
Tastes great.
More Kivo inside. Kivo Gari Soaking Mix. A taste of Ghana.
Gentlemen, so let's start with you. First, you tell us your name and then you pose your question.
Okay, thank you, and hello everyone, good evening. My name is Carla Titekpoda, and I would like to warmly greet our distinguished guest and Her Excellency. That was a very beautiful speech you gave right now, a lecture actually. My question is, how do you see Ghana leveraging its position as the host of AFTA in maximizing market readiness and competitiveness based on the benefits that AFTA brings to our region and our country? Thank you.
So let's go to my right. There are two gentlemen here about three of them. So let's take their questions. Your name, where you're coming from, and your question very briefly.
All right, my name is Nana Fumberima from NADMO. I want to ask, when Her Excellency was delivering her lecture, she made mention that immigrants, illegal immigrants, I'm very sure is a major problem for us. I want to ask, is there something we can do to at least reduce it?
Okay, please, my name is Ishmael Kwame Apia. I'm from Onville Impact Trust. My question is very simple. In the lecture, I noticed that there were two keywords that keep playing out. That is multilateral and multipolar. The question I want to ask is that which one is best for Ghana, and better if we are applying both? In which ways can we apply those both to benefit Ghana? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Edmond, and Honorable, congratulations for the excellent presentation. Based on your own experience and what you've seen, you've actually highlighted that implementation of certain key decisions have not been effective. Based on your own experience, what do you propose to be some of the key things that we should do to fast-track the implementation of certain decisions that will actually benefit the development of Africa country? Thank you.
All right, we can take two more and then we'll take, all right, that gentleman on my left.
All right, thank you very much. Good evening. My name is Ketchovs Atengle, representing Democracy Hub. Honorable Her Excellency, that's a very beautiful presentation. But in the submissions, we get to see that Africa, as we have it now is not united in our voice within the global order. This disunity or uncommon position within this global order, don't we see that as symptomatic of the conditions even in Ghana? As a country, we don't have common positions, or it's difficult to have common positions as we interact with the world largely. I didn't see anything about the domestic positions, how to address these issues domestically so that we can build policy coherence, consensus on some of these things, even as we look at addressing this regionally.
All right, thank you very much. And we'll take the last one at the back for this first set of, okay, let's do you, or come to you at the back, very briefly so that we can answer.
Thank you so much. My name is Seydou Nusa Jaminja. I'm from the Northeast region. Her Excellency, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. In your presentation, I noticed that you are so much passionate about peace and security. So I want to find out, as young people, as usually they say, are the future leaders, what are some of the things government of Ghana is putting in place, or even the West African countries are putting in place to make sure that they see youth as the center for peace? Because before there can be peace in a nation is a youth, and even if it is war, is a youth. So how can we, the youth, see ourselves as the center of peace? Thank you.
All right, Your Excellency.
I think I've got it. So how can Ghana leverage AFCFTA and the fact that we have the Secretariat present here? That's what I referred to when I said there's a difference between market access and market readiness. Market readiness means that we are going to actively work with our private sector to help them to understand what AFCFTA entails, what opportunities it creates, and how they can best leverage those opportunities. I mean, let's remember that the majority of our enterprises are small and medium enterprises. And therefore, they don't have that much money to be able to do all of this research and understand how to interface even with the markets on the continent themselves. That's what institutions like the Ghana Export Promotion Authority, and because Ghana Investment Promotion Center is to harness inward investments, but Ghana Export Promotion Authority is supposed to support our export markets. The Ghana Exim and all of those associated Ministry of Trade agencies, funds, and programs that are there to support the private sector. We really have to focus on how we help the private sector to understand AFCFTA and work with it. But at the same time, we've got to make sure that there is institutional readiness among the key institutions responsible for implementation, not least those responsible for trade facilitation, customs, ports, airports, so that they also know and understand what the framework is and can allow businesses both importing into Ghana and exporting from Ghana to benefit from it. And at the same time, make sure that those who would abuse the provisions, that the mechanisms that we have in place can prevent that so that the intended beneficiaries can have the most out of it. Can we do something to address illegal migration? Yes, we can. Remember that the ECOWAS protocols that allow free movement into our region only say that you are entitled to the right of abode, the right of establishment. But to exercise that right, you must comply with government procedures, right? And so if you don't exercise the rights, by extension, we can ask you to leave. If you are not registered as a refugee, then we are not compelled to keep you, because we make a distinction between refugees and migrants, and especially illegal migrants. But I think one of the things that has to be done within the context of ECOWAS is to develop the mechanisms for this to happen, because if it's not handled carefully, there are sensitive issues and they could backfire. And we also have Ghanaians in other ECOWAS member states, so we don't want a situation where there's tit for tat actions taken that at the end of the day fray an organization that is already quite fragile. But it's not to say that we can't do anything about it. We can use the existing mechanisms to ensure that we have a process for returning people when they have not complied with our legal frameworks and established legally to stay and business in Ghana. Now, when I talk about multilateral and multipolar, which is best for Ghana, remember I said the multilateral framework is used to respond to collective action problems, which means these are problems which are global in nature, and we have to be able to speak to them and to be able to negotiate our positions within that global framework. For instance, when you're talking about climate change is not a problem that is only affecting Africa. Yes, it will affect Africa in a particular way, but it affects the rest of the world as well. So if we're thinking about reducing global carbon emissions, if we're thinking about putting in place financing mechanisms to be able to help affected countries mitigate, build resilience, then of course we are looking at global solutions. But there are particular things that we need to focus on, I have just argued, at a continental level, in order to improve our integration and take advantage of it. And in that context, we are looking within a more multipolar environment, right? Because we're looking at an African Global South environment. There's a place for that as well. The challenge of our diplomacy is to be able to most effectively in the different fora, to be able to achieve our own foreign policy priorities, which at the end of the day is focused on enhancing our own domestic position on all of the issues that are important to us. Now, how do we fast track implementation? It requires a certain amount of real political will and commitment. When President Kagame was the chair of the Authority of Heads of State and Government, he put some this was in 2019. He gave himself some targets: institutional reform, making sure that the AFCFTA was signed and ratified by the majority of member states, focusing on the implementation of the single African air transport market, and making sure that the necessary agreements were ratified by the majority of member states, operationalizing the AU Peace Fund, and at the same time looking at contributions to the financial running of the organization. And he achieved a significant amount of that agenda because it was not just the African Union Commission, but Rwandan diplomats acting for and on behalf of their president, who were now interacting with the member states to say, can you move this along and make it happen? So if we really want to maximize the opportunity to be seen to have made a difference during His Excellency President Mahama's chairmanship of the African Union, it's going to put a lot of responsibility on Ghanaian diplomats in African member states, right, to engage with their host authorities, not just in furtherance of our own national interest, but this time supporting the African agenda because our president is leading the Continental Initiative. And so we're going to have to work very hard to be able to make a difference in that kind of implementation. Therefore, you cannot have a situation where you expect to have outcomes without investment. And it means that we have to be ready to invest in our embassies on this continent. Send our brightest and our best if we are going to make the most of President Mahama's term as chair of the African Union Commission. Now, given that internally we have our differences, and of course you're talking about our partisan differences, and that reflects on the continent as well, how do we actually achieve this solidarity? Well, the point I'm making to you is that we don't have the luxury now of maintaining that level of partisanship. We are in front of, as a continent, several fires. If we do not make the efforts to build consensus internally, we are not going to be able to engage with one voice externally. I mean, if you're looking at political leanings, this is a very typically Ghanaian representation of political interest, right? Well, the secretary to the president is a particularly trusted position. And it would not come with a certain understanding of his leanings, right? So let's say that over here you see NPP and NDC, but perhaps a more matured version of NPP and NDC. And I would argue that that's what we need across, especially within our country context. Because at the end of the day, yes, we may be part of different political parties, and we want to achieve things for our political groupings. But we only have one country, and we want to live in a peaceful country. And one of the things that I really would like to leave you with, especially when talking about this issue of peace and security, is that now I have seen countries that have been in war. When I was Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa, I was getting South Sudan and Sudan to now look at their outstanding issues from their comprehensive peace agreement and their implementation. So I used to visit Khartoum quite regularly, and Juba as well. And I was surprised by Khartoum as a city, its history, its culture along the banks of the River Nile. In the evenings, it was beautiful. If you go to Khartoum today, it is a wreck. The airport that I landed in when it was a whole airport, right? And their VIP lounge, which was very nice. And what you see today, I mean, it's miserable. And when you think about the fact that they are not the only African country that finds themselves in this situation. If we take for granted where we are, and we believe that we're never going to find ourselves in a situation where we will be challenged, we might find ourselves overwhelmed. After all, there are many countries within this region that have seen themselves affected by conflict. The AES states are where they are and have their challenges. A lot of those coups d'etats and unconstitutional changes of government were because people were not satisfied with the way in which the government was responding to the security challenge. And so they felt that the army would do a better job. And indeed, when constitutional changes of government took place, they were popular. And so we shouldn't assume that democracy and our democracy, even though it has lasted for 30 plus years, is automatically insulated from all of those things. So I would argue that we have to have a much more mature way of engaging with each other to protect what we have. And finally, how can young people be the center of peace? I think that the institutions we have, and after all in Ghana we do some peace infrastructure. We've got the Peace Council, we've got all kinds of civil society organizations involved in these things. I think there has to be a deliberate effort to make sure that young people are included in these processes, because very often they are the ones who are recruited anyway to be part of these. In Ghana, we don't have terrorist organizations, I may not say that, but they are the people who are recruited both by criminal networks and at the same time with organizations that don't have good intentions and would rather cause disruption and be productive. And so we've got to make sure that they are actively involved in finding and helping to build solutions. Because if we don't include them and we don't also focus on them, then we're not going to be in a position to protect what we have.
Wow. So let's take the next set of questions. Can we see by hand? We have Dr. Pumpuni as well. Let's take from different people. I'll take you, and then the gentleman at the back. So let's start with the gentleman there, and then we'll come to Dr. Pumpuni, and then you.
Thank you very much, Her Excellency, for the lecture and the submission as well. I'm Wisdom from TV3. From your submission, I had a lot of topic and sectors that you were talking about, from the economy to security to institutional coordination. I want to ask you, based on your experience and on your own assessment, what is the highest risk to Africa, the highest risk to Africa and Ghana in terms of the fragility and the small economies that I did, is that you have a scale of preference and you have to look at the ones that are the top priorities that you have to deal with. Though I believe that all the other sectors are equally important, but which ones should we not joke with and pay closer attention and give more priority to? Thank you.
All right, so the gentleman in the smoke.
All right, thank you so much. My name is Prince Noah Johnson Ananga from Tamale. My question is, as the world, the youth has the largest population in Africa. And my question is, how is government, institutions or organizations working towards preparing the young people of Africa to prepare, position, and then implement solutions that will take us through this evolving change in the global settings? Thank you.
There's another gentleman in the long sleeve there.
Thank you, Honorable. I'm Clement from Center for Governance and Security Affairs. So, in your presentation, you spoke about a number of sectors, which I think Godwin from TV3 has asserted that. The first one I would ask has to do with AI governance here in Ghana. And I've seen that, I think last year, May, the Minister of Communication did the launch on that. Do we take it from the balkanization of having like division in terms of African countries, or we should go as AU in terms of essentialism in advancing our AI governance frameworks? And then also, at SEXA, we did some study last year on how China is actually being smart about the changing global multilateralism to bilateralism in terms of how they advance their BRIs, their Belt and Road Initiatives. They approach Africa from a bilateral standpoint, like they negotiate with Africa from bilateral. So they will negotiate with, let's say, Kenya to Tanzania to Ghana. What should AU do to that in terms of repelling that kind of angle? Thank you.
Thank you too. Do we have any more? Yes, Dr. Pomponi.
Thank you very much. Thank you again for the lecture. Two questions. I really like your idea about the whole of government approach. And in my mind, I think of it like how we do, say, education or health. Everybody knows the sector policy for education. You can go online and get it. And there are many stakeholders who can track it. The process for putting it together is inclusive. The budgeting is known. The systems for tracking performance and all of that. And I think that's what we need for foreign policy, because as you have said, the interconnectedness of sectors in trying to deal with the issues that we are dealing with requires this type of integration. I don't think the way the foreign policy is set up now can respond if there's not something drastic. I don't know how you see that happen. How do you operationalize that? So that would be my first question. The second question is what Ambassador Dike Osei talked about. Yes, Ghana will take over AU leadership, and there's an opportunity there. But we know Ghana cannot do it alone. So who are the other champions that we should be looking at in the continent? Because it's not an easy question when you think. But somebody, just as you mentioned how President Kagame pushed certain objectives, we need a cohort of leaders, similar to what we had in the African Renaissance period, to really push the continent to respond. Otherwise, it's going to be very, very challenging. Thank you.
Thank you too. Let's take from Dr. Kopo. And then we'll come back for the next set of questions.
Yes, I'm John Osai Kopo from CDD Ghana. So my question has to do with creating the right set of values that can underpin where we ought to be. As an undergrad student, I became cynical of international politics when I read the book, The Games Nations Play. And so how do we move this global order from thinking about these things as games nations play and building the right set of values that does not recognize these things as games, but as a moral imperative to address some of the critical challenges that faces us as a continent and a country?
All right. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Over to you.
So, what is the highest risk to Ghana and Africa? I would say that we have, as I just said in the paper, we have interconnected risks. To focus on a single risk is perhaps not adequately addressing the challenge. And that's why I made an effort not just to address the peace and security challenge, but also talk about the economic challenge. Because fundamentally, the problems are economic. We are not delivering development fast enough to be able to respond to the demands that our countries are facing. One of the most crucial ones is youth unemployment. We're not delivering jobs fast enough to be able to give young people opportunity, and so they become easy prey to other non-state actors, especially criminal groups and actors, right? To be co-opted into other undesirable activities that at the end of the day create more challenges for all of us. So we have to have a comprehensive approach to these things, because just focusing on specific issues and dealing with these things through a siloed approach will not help us to address the challenge that we face. And the point that I'm making is that both at the national level, at the sub-regional, when I say sub-regional, I mean ECOWAS, because West Africa is a sub-region of Africa, and then at the regional level, in all of these different theaters, we have to approach our national policy, our diplomatic engagement, looking at how do we further our domestic objectives through our diplomatic and foreign policy engagement. And we need to do it in a way that prioritizes the key objectives we have. And it's about peace, stability, security, and development. So I would say that it's essentially a multi-pronged approach, and that's why you need a whole of government approach. But I would say we need to focus on the economy, but if you focus on the economy at the expense of dealing with your societal challenges, and you don't understand and connect them, your approach is probably going to be limited in its responses. It's not just about new infrastructure. As important as infrastructure is, it's also making sure that we have government institutions that are enablers of economic growth and development and not a drag. And we also have to work, government has to work in a cohesive manner to make sure that it's delivering for the citizens. Because if we don't, I've just told you, aid is decreasing sharply. The kind of grants and assistance that we've been used to previously, and we think that, it's been part of the past and it's going to be part of our future, it doesn't look like it. So if we're not going to focus on how we use the resources we have much better than we currently do to address our critical challenges, we might find ourselves in undesirable circumstances. Now, how is government preparing the youth to be able to engage in these processes? I think that we shouldn't always wait for government to do everything. That's not to say that government doesn't have a role to play. Of course it does. And we have ministries that engage and have part of their policy as engaging young people. And those ministries also have to act at the regional and district levels. So again, we have multi-layered governance. Thank God we have institutions that go all the way down to the districts, and we need to have programs that engage young people at that level. Now, AI as a national level or multilateral priority, I would say both, because we need to be clear on what we want as a country as far as AI governance is concerned, right? And how we intend to make use of AI as an enabler of growth and development. But we also have to recognize the risks associated with AI. And we have to understand that in this very rapidly evolving sector, the frameworks that govern cooperation are not yet established. And that's why the Secretary General has been, over the last year, has been constantly emphasizing the need to have inclusive AI governance. And at the same time, to make sure that in thinking about that, we're also thinking about the risks that it could pose for humanity as a whole. I mean, over the last couple of months, we've seen the way AI has been deployed in conflict. Let's face it, if you have those capabilities, you're confident. If you don't have them, and you get attacked by someone that does have those capabilities, I mean, you're a sitting duck, right? And so if we're going to be thinking about how those actions can be governed and how we make that certain unilateral actions are encouraged. We can't do that only at the national level. We are going to have to engage multilaterally, and that's the reason that in Africa's common foreign policy, we should think about advocating for an African position on AI governance. Now, China and Africa. I think that China has been very strategic, not just in promoting engagement with African member states through FOCAC, through this new trade initiative, but at the same time projecting itself as a country that continues to respect and wants to engage within the multilateral order, while at the same time they also have their bilateral initiatives. And I think that's what smart diplomacy does, that focuses on executing a government strategy. And we need to be able to do the same. Because to expect that somebody's thinking about how to ensure their competitive advantage means that they are going to offer you handouts when their own people are struggling and competing in that environment to be able to advance themselves. If you're waiting for that to happen, I think it's extremely wishful thinking. Now, when I say a whole of government approach, as you said, Dr. Pumpune Asante, we've got a situation where we have stakeholder approaches to almost all social and economic critical issues. But we don't have the same inclusive stakeholder approach to foreign policy. And so the way we do it across other ministries, departments, and agencies, which means interministerial committees with stakeholder representation, key government departments and agencies, civil society, private sector, has to be the new normal in the way in which we think about our foreign policy priorities, especially when we know the implications for everybody are going to be significant. And I would encourage that that should happen in a much more constructive way. And I think it is something that civil society should advocate for. Foreign policy is no longer going to be a domain where it's just going to be dealt with in the context of specific meetings and, you know, like the various COPs or the General Assembly or ECOSOC or any of those things. Foreign policy is playing out in real time on social media, right? And we see a lot of the debates that happen between even conflicting parties actually being, as it were, aired out on X and on Facebook and other platforms. So we are in a situation we're not just, you know, in a position where countries relax and then they go and have these discussions and they come back and they think about, so how do we make this work? There are countries that are aggressively promoting their interest using all the platforms available to them. And the impact on the public is immediate, it is emotional, it is engaging, and it can create crisis if you are not careful. And so therefore we have to move away from this secretive foreign policy approach that sort of has it as an exclusive preserve and recognize that it now has to be much more inclusive. And that's the reason why I say we need a whole of government approach. Then who are the other champions who could help to move these things forward? Well, I think that if you look at the previous AU chairs since the beginning of this decade, those chairs who have been more proactive on trying to advance a continental agenda have been President Kagame, and he was the chair of the AU in 2019, have been to some extent President Sisi, even though his focus was more peace and security related. President Ruto has not yet been chair of the African Union, but when he was elected into government, one of the first things he did was that he took on the role of climate champion. They had the climate conference in Nairobi, and he immediately began to try to mobilize the continent towards having common positions in the negotiation on climate and climate finance. And so if you are looking at those who have acted, I would say that these are a few, and in addition to South Africa, because South Africa took over the AU chairmanship at the time of the COVID pandemic. As a matter of fact, it was the last summit, and then 2 weeks later, almost everything shut down because of COVID. At that time, they were thinking about prioritizing financial, but instead they prioritized the COVID response. They were very proactive about it. So if you're looking at those countries that have the capacity and willingness to engage, I would say that those are the countries that I would refer to. Now, Nigeria in West Africa is always big brother. but we haven't seen Nigeria as proactive as it could be over the last couple of years. And so I do hope that they become more engaged, because they are, if you like, the biggest mover in this part of our world. And when they engage and they are constructive about it, they can make a positive impact. So off the top of my head, I would say that those are the countries that you are immediately looking at and that we should be engaging in order to try to advance whatever agenda Ghana wants to further over its chairmanship of the African Union. Now, when you talk about creating the values and, not have countries see the games, I think that it's important for us to recognize that every single country in this world is focused on maximizing its own benefits. We would do it if we had the opportunity. Others try to do it. In this continent, many other countries are trying to do it. So when we talk about a values-based agenda, those values are actually written into our current instruments. Whether or not they are reflected in our policies and actions depend on implementation. That's why I think the greater focus has to be on not creating new things, but revisiting what we have and making them operational. Because if we don't do that, you can create, as many new positions as you like, but at the end of the day, we'll have the same impact, and it will really not inure to our benefit. Back to you, Madam.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And at this juncture, we can't take any more questions because of our time. I'm sorry about that. It's been an interesting lecture. Let's acknowledge Human Nuruzi, Political Counselor, British High Commission, and also Mr. Francis Fifi Kumson, General Manager, Joy Brands, also in our midst. And before we conclude on the event today, we'll ask our chairman to give us some few remarks.
I think that we've had a very good evening. And when we started, I suggested that perhaps this could be the beginning of a series of discussions which could become an input into where we're heading once Ghana takes over the chairmanship of the AU. But I like rather to limit myself to governance and the role that it plays in our ability to respond to the challenges. And I'll use a rather simple example. If we do not have proper leadership with experience and who apply the basic rules of governance, we do not have the legitimacy even to be able to unite. And I'm saying, I'm intentionally saying, talking about experience, because when the speaker had finished speaking, I'm sure that most of you said to yourself, this is experience. This demonstrates that Africa has quality. And if you actually allow people who have done it and have thought through it and are sensible and are pragmatic, we build the kind of nations, and coming together becomes easy. So I want you to give our speaker one big round of applause. For making us very proud that we are Ghanaians. Hannah, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a rich and necessary lecture. We opened the night by asking what Ghana and Africa can do as the old rule-based order weakens. The lecture leaves us, with a clear answer that we cannot simply wait for a seat at someone else's table, but we must help build the ones that reflect our own voice. And our thanks to Her Excellency Hannah Sewatete for her candor and her depth. Also to our chairperson, Ambassador D.K. Osei, and of course to CDD Ghana for convening this platform once again. Thank you all for being here. Safe travels home, and we have some refreshments. Have a good evening.
ɛyɛ biribi ketewa bi na ɛde nsakraeɛ ba ɛtɔ da a ɛhyɛ aseɛ firi baabi a wote ɔhwɛpa ɛnyɛ dede na mmom ɛyɛ din bere a obiara ani nni wo so.
Suban pasha asefi meso ne woso wofie.
Good conduct, great life is brought to you by
Indomie.
Tastes great.
More Kivo inside. Kivo Gary Soaking Mix. A taste of Ghana.
Hey, what's up?
Life. It's moving so fast. Yesterday I was in class 4. Today I'm almost in JHS. My shoes don't fit me anymore. My voice is deeper. I was watching cartoons, but now they say I'm too old for that.
The more things change, the more they'll stay the same. I still love you the same.
Come and sit, Dad.
In a world that keeps changing, Calipo still keeps making sweet memories.
I still love it.
Dad, I told you to have a sip not to finish it.
Calipo food juice drink, making sweet memories. This advert is FDA approved.
When malaria shows up, it doesn't knock. It just takes over.
Oh, no. This fever is too much.
When malaria comes, respond with Mala2. Fight malaria with Mala2 tablets or syrup from Ernest Chemists. Test for malaria first before taking Mala2. If symptoms persist for more than 48 hours, see a doctor. This advert is FDA approved. All these were food.
Food to the brain, man, Kasa.
I only took small pill. Small? You pour like waterfall.
Let's check the camera, shall we? What camera?